So let's get back to, let's quit distracting myself. The reason I'm convinced that I have found the blaze and the treasure, and in a sense they're one and the same thing, is because, as I have said in the past year, my hunt has very much come to be a following a story. We know that in the first chapter of Thrill of the Chase, I don't think it's any coincidence that the first chapter of Thrill of the Chase is called Important Literature. I think important literature is at the heart of this entire hunt. It's not a scientifically based hunt. It's not a hunt based on maps, kind of like I was trying to figure out the first 3 years. In August, I'll be celebrating my 4th year of doing the hunt. I would love for my find to be the 4th anniversary, virtually, of my hunt. Certainly isn't important that it is. But everything about my solve has to do with following a couple of narratives. We know from important literature that Ben takes us into a bookstore, and he starts off by saying, the big time authors like Fitzgerald and Hemingway are not really where it's at, as far as he's concerned. His books are where it's at. Books by Robert Redford, if he ever wrote one, would be where it's at. And of course, Robert Redford wrote a book called The Outlaw Trail, A Journey Through Time. And other books are where it's at, but not necessarily Hemingway and Fitzgerald. When Forrest Fenn says this, I think that first chapter, the opening of the entire hunt, as it were, the beginning of the chase, is trying to tell us something very, very important, and that is that literature is important. Important literature. I think he is saying that we're not talking about old school authors like Hemingway. We're talking about books that are relevant to the chase. Go out and read a book or 2 or 3 or 4 and find them. He makes reference to Robert Redford. I went out and got that book, the book Outlaw Trail, not because I was smart enough to go search for it like Fenn would have you do. Fenn has said in the past, when I do something like say something, what I called in my last video, I got a little carried away with weirdness, but when I do something wrong, when I make a statement that's not correct, like Robert Redford, if he ever wrote a book, he expects people to double check that. Forrest Fenn said one time he really expects us to work, and he really does. He really expects us to work for this treasure. And it took me a while to figure out to what extent he really meant that. He really means that. So I went on some of the blogs, and people had said exactly that. They said, well, you know, Robert Redford, he wrote a book, and he's written some other books, and, you know, one of them happens to be about the Rocky Mountains and the outlaws. But it's not, I don't think it's all about the Rocky Mountains, but, you know, they had their different places in the Rocky Mountains where they would go hide. Don't forget about the girl in the cashier who Forrest Fenn talks to, and she covers her face with a coffee cup, and Fenn says it's as if she was hiding behind the coffee cup. I think little tiny things like that are hints. I think you have to be so on your toes with Forrest Fenn. I think Forrest Fenn is so meticulous. I think he is so well thought out in his chase. He has said that. He has told us, folks, I worked on this for years. I'm assuming during those years that he, you know, He rearranged things, and he changed words here and there, and he thought of things. My last video about the Howard Hughes connection, I got poo-pooed a little bit on that by people who said, I think the white sneaker thing's wrong. I was a little irritated with people for their own sake that would immediately say, no, other people wear white shoes. If you watch that video and see what my theory is, it was not white shoes. Forrest Fenn had a story about a specific situation where a man's wearing white sneakers with a suit. That very much fits the profile of Howard Hughes if you go back. I mean, that's why in the Aviator, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, they actually show him, they made a point of having him wear white sneakers with suits or dress slacks. It's a real phenomenon, folks, but what I'm trying to say is if you read something like that and immediately say, you know, I saw pictures of Harry Truman in the summertime, he would wear white patent leather shoes. I'm like, well, how are you ever going to find this treasure if Forrest Fenn says white sneakers and you immediately just change the narrative to white shoes? You're never going to find this, because I believe this whole chase is based on narratives. And I think when Forrest Fenn talks about J.D. Salinger and Catcher in the Rye, and Catcher in the Rye being this book that he totally identified with, I think that's extremely important. And part of what he said was he liked Catcher in the Rye, he loved it, he felt a lot of it was about him, but he would like to write his own book where he kind of blended them together, because J.D. Salinger left things out of the book that he would put in about himself, etc. He's talking about morphing together narratives. Forrest Fenn tells us a lot. He tells us a lot in his interviews. I have come to understand now. I look at this spot that I have found. I have a spot where I can follow the road to where to get out of the car and walk to the blaze. It's that exciting. It's that succinct a solve. Yeah, I mean, it is like right there on Google Maps, Google Earth, that I know exactly where to drive to get out of the car to go to the blaze. It's exactly like he said when he said, whoever finds this will know exactly where they're going. And I'd even say when I started to look at this area and I started looking at the roads and some of the landmarks around the area, I saw subtle, coincidental, well, I'm getting muddled here. I saw things that I thought he had hinted about. I'll just leave it at that. So it's almost like if you were there and you were going to take a road, you'd go, oh, I remember that. He referred to something like that in Thrill the Chase. You know what I'm saying? Almost like he's letting you know as you're getting closer that, oh, I'm on the right track. This road, the name of this road is such and such. It's really exciting. So back to my theory and back to what got me to where I'm going to be going. Literature, narratives. Remember when he talks about, I think it's at the end of Thrill the Chase, and he talks about how for a minute he was having a dream and he thought he was looking for the treasure on Gardner Island. And he thought he found the treasure. I think it's something like that. I haven't gone back and double checked it. And he got so scared he woke up or something. Think of that for me. Gardner Island is a real place in New York, state of New York. This is something that happened centuries ago. This was a guy. Who was the guy? I'm not even going to look it up, folks. But a pirate buried a treasure on Gardner Island. Imagine if you knew that. Imagine if you knew that Gardner Island, this real place in New York State, that there was a narrative about him burying a treasure, say, on the north side of the island. And so you went and you researched the north side of the island. That's kind of what I've done. Blended together with Fenn's own life. Because, of course, this is Fenn's story. This is Fenn's stomping grounds in my solve. This is the West Yellowstone area, the Madison River and Yellowstone. I've said before, and I'll say it again, I believe where warm waters halt is Yellowstone. I did a video talking about all the thermal features and showing how, all this silly stuff I threw in some of those videos. It was interesting though. But, it shows, basically what you're dealing with when you're in Yellowstone, which is especially if you drive around when the air is cooler. All you see is areas where warm waters halt. You see steam rising off of these. You see water rising, or steam. You see steam rising off these hot spots, these thermal vents with water. Sometimes I think Fenn has just given us the most simple clues that we can just work up the most complicated rationale for. When I first heard Forrest Fenn, when I first saw the quote that Forrest Fenn did, well, let's backtrack a little bit. We know that Forrest Fenn, as a youth in the Yellowstone area, would go bathing in hot spots in the rivers. There are hot spots in the rivers, as I just said, the Fire Hole, Boiling Springs, these places where people bathed, and Forrest Fenn himself bathed. And I think he had found himself his own personal place where he bathed. And the water would be warm or hot. And you could sit in there for hours. It must have been incredibly comfortable to just sit in a river and be warm, like sitting in a bathtub. But then if you would get out of that area and you would move into the wider current of the river, suddenly you're hitting the cold water and it's no longer comfortable and you back up. You stay in this warm area. So, not the first one to even think of this, of course. So many of my ideas are not new. My solve is new, but so many of my ideas are not new. So, what did Forrest Fenn say one time when someone said, "What are you specifically talking about?" Or give us an idea of what you mean. What I think she said, "What does warm mean to you when you talk about where warm waters halt?" And Forrest Fenn said, "Comfortable." I mean, now I look at it and I go, he just told us the truth. Comfortable. He's talking about when he bathed in these hot spots in Yellowstone as a child, as a youth. Not even complicated. I had a whole theory that comfortable meant calm, because that's another meaning, I think, for comfortable. And for much of my search, when I would look at things, I would think comfortable meant the end of calm water going into rapids. It's a map, right? When you're in that mentality of creating maps, and that's your focal point, is creating a map, rather than having a map created for you, which is what I had happen with me, because I was following narratives. I was having things explained to me, more or less. Imagine a pirate in the Gardner Island in New York State. Obviously, this is just an example, folks. I know that's not the Rocky Mountains. I'm trying to explain the way I figured my solve out. How much easier it would be for you. If you were able to find a narrative that fit the poem, would you find that at least worth following up on? I did. So, I would read something as simple as comfortable and think, oh, he's talking about when the water reverts to like rapids, where it's uncomfortable and it's rough and it's even potentially dangerous. Okay. What do I mean when I talk about important literature? I think there's so many things about important literature that I could discuss, but for the sake of brevity, I want to talk about a couple of things having to do with Catcher in the Rye, because I think Catcher in the Rye is so important. Ben tells us Catcher in the Rye is important. Catcher in the most important for him. Catcher in the Rye, personally, I didn't like the book. I had to read it, I'm sure, as a kid at some point in my upbringing, and by one of those teachers that Forrest Fenn talks about. And I found the book depressing. I still find it depressing. It's a book about a guy who's trying to get himself together. He's been kicked out of his second school, and he's not maturing well. He's finding growing up to be a real pain. He drinks. And he's spending a few days in Manhattan, and he's trying to get together with old schoolmates and teachers and people like that, and kind of figure out what to do with his life. And he just isn't he just doesn't have it together. And it's really a book about that. Part 3 coming up.